Thank you, Stephen, for those very kind words of introduction. I'm delighted to be here in Vancouver, to have the privilege to participate in this very inspired and inspiring Federation initiative, underpinned by the values, as you put it, Stephen, of Tikkun Olam, of Chesed, of Tzedakah, of Klal Yisrael. As my father taught me when I was too young to understand the profundity of his words, when he said to me that the pursuit of justice, tzedek tzedek tirdof, is equal, as he put it, to all the other commandments combined. But as my mother would then say to me when she heard these words from my father, both of them zichronam livracha, blessed membership, if you want to pursue justice, you have to understand, you have to feel the injustice about you. You have to go in and about your community and beyond and feel the injustice and combat the injustice. Otherwise, the pursuit of justice remains a theoretical abstraction. And indeed, those teachings of my parents underpin my remarks this evening. For we meet at what I would say is a critical, unique moment, a coming together of political earthquakes which has generated an international gathering storm, dramatized by the greatest humanitarian catastrophe since the end of the Second World War, captured in the tragic and iconic image of 3-year-old Aylan Kurda being washed up on a Turkish beach, giving a face, a name, an identity to this horrific tragedy. And what we have to understand is that we are now in the 5th year of horrors and atrocities anchored in Syria, which has resulted, as we meet, in over 250,000 killed, in some 12.2 forcibly displaced Syrian people, more than half of whom are children. And when I share these statistics with you, we have to understand that behind every statistic is a human being. Behind every statistic is another Aylan Kurda washed up on that beach or horribly disfigured, maimed, and killed in Syria. And in addition to the 12.2 million forcibly displaced within Syria, we have 4 million refugees who have fled to neighboring countries. We have seen hospitals burned, schools destroyed, children trafficked. And as I said some 3 years ago in Parliament after meeting with a group of Syrian Canadians, that while these atrocities were unfolding in Syria, the international community was behaving as a bystander. The world dithered while Syrians died. And so, in our 5th year, as we've entered the 5th year of these atrocities, what is it that we can and indeed must do? For it is not enough to just sound the alarm that the iconic image has generated. We must translate that alarm into action. And just let me put before you an action, a plan that Canada, in concert with the international community, must engage in. First, we have to understand that this humanitarian and refugee catastrophe is consequence, not cause. The cause are the atrocities and horrors of the last 4.5 years in Syria. And so the first thing is that Canada, in concert with the international community, must anchor a ceasefire in Syria. We need to implement the responsibility to protect doctrine. I recall when, again, in Parliament and elsewhere, some 4 years ago, I first spoke about the need to implement the responsibility to protect doctrine when then, quote unquote, only 4,000 Syrians had died. Those of us who were calling on the international community to intervene and protect the innocent Syrian civilians were told that if you intervene, that will lead to civil war, that will lead to sectarian warfare, that will lead to jihadists coming in. Everything we were told would happen if we intervened happened because we didn't intervene, including the dreaded ISIS and other terrorist groups who have spread their hatred and murder beyond Syria, beyond Europe, globally. And so the first thing that we need to do at this point is address the cause of the horrors and atrocities. Implement a ceasefire, implement a no-fly zone to stop the dreaded barrel bombing, and implement humanitarian corridors and safe havens for the delivery of humanitarian assistance and the protection of medical relief workers as we protect the citizens themselves. That's the first thing. The second thing is we have to dramatically increase our humanitarian assistance to the 12.2 forcibly displaced persons in Syria. This is a compelling call on our conscience as a country and on the international community. Third, we need to dramatically increase our humanitarian assistance to the refugees in the neighboring countries, lest those countries become destabilized, unless they too result in an increased refugee flow. We should understand that, for example, 7 out of 10 refugees in Lebanon, more than 2/3 of whom are children, 7 out of 10 refugees, Syrian refugees in Lebanon, I'm using this as only one example, live below the poverty line. A year ago, it was 50%. You see the dramatic deterioration in the human condition. And so we must, with respect to humanitarian assistance, with respect to anchoring a ceasefire, we need as well to bring together the international community in concert for all these things. We need Canada to work together with the European Union, with the Arab countries, and yes, where necessary, with Putin's Russia, to anchor that ceasefire, to bring about that necessary humanitarian relief. And I might add, parenthetically, that Putin's Russia, when it has not been annexing the Crimea, or invading the Ukraine, or selling missiles to Iran, has together with Iran been training and arming and financing the Syrian aggression. And a word about Iran. We meet as an agreement has been concluded with respect to the nuclear threat. But there are 4 other threats. 4 other threats that the negotiating process, as well as the agreement, has overshadowed, if not sanitized. I'm referring here to the terrorist threat, to the hegemonic threat, to the incitement threat, and the massive domestic repression in Syria. And I'll say one word with respect to what needs to be done with regard to Iran at this point. The 21st century, just with regard to one of the threats for reasons of time, the 21st century began with Khamenei, the Iranian leader, saying January 3rd, 2001, that there can be no resolution to the Arab-Israeli conflict without the annihilation of the Jewish state. Regrettably, even since the conclusion of this agreement, the nuclear agreement, Khamenei and other Iranian leaders have actually intensified their incitement to hate and genocide, repeatedly calling for the removal of this cancerous tumor, Israel, from the Middle East. And so here, there is a role, indeed a responsibility, for Canada and the international community. Incitement to hate and genocide is a violation of the Genocide Convention. It's sometimes forgotten that the Genocide Convention not only prohibits genocide, it also prohibits incitement to genocide. And indeed, some 4 years ago, our Foreign Affairs Subcommittee in the Canadian Parliament unanimously concluded that Iran had already committed the crime of incitement to genocide prohibited under the Genocide Convention. Yet as we meet, not one state in the international community has undertaken its obligations, not a policy option, but its international juridical obligation to hold Iran to account for its state-sanctioned incitement to hate and to genocide. One example, one of a number of juridical remedies, is that any state party to the Genocide Convention can hold Iran, which is also a state party to the Genocide Convention, to account for its standing violation of that Genocide Convention. Yet not one state has yet undertaken this obligatory requirement, yet another initiative that Canada, in concert with the international community, can undertake. And finally, we need to understand that Canada, together with the international community, must reverse the flow. We must begin to rebuild Syria. We must create a situation where refugees return to Syria rather than refugees forced to flee Syria, let alone the internally displaced. And in addition to Canada as a country, as a government, in concert with the international community, each one of us has a role to play. The Federation, NGOs, individuals, we have a role to play in the final responsibility that we have as a country and as a community and as individuals with respect to Syria, and that is the resettlement of Syrian refugees, as many as possible, as quickly as possible. We did it with regard to Vietnamese refugees. We did it with regard to refugees from Kosovo. We must do it now with regard to Syrian refugees. And one final closing word, and it is perhaps the most important lesson, most important human rights lesson that I was ever taught, and this was by my daughter, now 34 years of age, who, when she was 15 years of age, said to me, "Daddy, if you want to understand what needs to be done with respect to human rights, always ask yourself, at any time, in any situation, in any part of the world, is what is happening good for children? Is it good for children?" What has been happening in Syria, now in our 50 years, has not only not been good for children, it has been horrific for children, as it has been horrific with respect to the humanity in and outside of Syria. And as I said, more than half of those internally displaced, more than half of those who are refugees, many of those who are killed are children. At this point, during the 10 days where remembrance is so important for us, let us also appreciate that this evening should not only be an act of remembrance, of bearing witness to what is happening, but a remembrance to act. Im lo achshav, eimatai. If not now, when? Thank you.